A stunningly handsome CEO with messy black hair and a sharply defined jawline sits behind a sleek, modern high-end office desk in a luxurious penthouse. He wears a slightly unbuttoned white dress shirt beneath a charcoal blazer, radiating quiet dominance and raw charisma. His piercing eyes are locked on a breathtaking young waitress standing beside the desk. She wears a modest diner uniform, yet her delicate beauty is undeniable. Her posture is slightly tense, her eyes cast downward with a shy, blushing expression, hands nervously clasped in front of her. On the desk lies an open leather portfolio with $1,000 printed boldly on the top page. The CEO loosely holds a yellow gold fountain pen between his fingers, silently waiting for her answer. In the background of the luxurious office, a designer king-size bed is visible near the window, subtly hinting at the deeper implications of the offer. The room is drenched in golden hour light, pouring through massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm shadows and enhancing the emotional tension in this high-stakes cinematic moment. My name is Ellie, and I am 24 years old. I work as a veterinary assistant in a small clinic just outside Wichita, Kansas, and most days I love what I do. Caring for animals has always brought me a sense of calm and purpose that nothing else really gives me. I moved back in with my mom last year after struggling to keep up with rising rent and medical bills when I had to undergo a minor surgery that set me back financially. And although I hesitated at first, thinking I had outgrown my childhood home, she insisted it was temporary and said it would be good to be close again. My mom, whose name is Sandra, is 46 and works at the public library. She used to be this vibrant, goofy woman who read aloud with voices and danced to 80s music in the kitchen. She raised me alone after divorcing my dad when I was 12, and I always thought we were incredibly close. Things started to shift when she met Ray at a city council fundraiser. He was charming and polite. A manager at a local grocery chain widowed with 2 boys from his previous marriage. Jordan, who was 17, and Caleb, who was 14. At first, I tried to be supportive. I even helped her get ready for their first date, picking out earrings and teasing her like old times. But that version of us didn't last long once Ray became part of our daily lives. He was never outright rude, but there was this passive resistance in the way he carried himself around me, like he was always mildly inconvenienced by my presence. Never looking me in the eye, never asking questions, only speaking when absolutely necessary. When they got married 6 months later and he moved in with his sons, things got worse. The boys followed his lead and barely acknowledged me. We lived under the same roof, but rarely shared a real conversation. I chalked it up to transition pains and kept trying, offering to cook dinner or drive the boys to their activities, but everything I did felt invisible and, even worse, unwelcome. The house that once smelled like cinnamon rolls and sounded like shared laughter now felt cold and calculated, a place where I tiptoed to avoid sighs and side eyes. My mother, when I brought it up, would tell me to give them time, that I was being too sensitive, that blending families takes patience and maturity. And while I wanted to believe her, it was hard when I couldn't even get a simple good morning in return. I started spending longer hours at the clinic and made excuses to stay at friends' places on weekends, anything to avoid the growing discomfort at home. But I never confronted her directly because she always reminded me of everything she had given up for me, that she could have remarried years ago if she hadn't focused on raising me, that I owed her my understanding and tolerance now that she was finally choosing her own happiness. I didn't ask for those sacrifices, and yet they hung over every disagreement like invisible chains, pulling at my guilt, making me feel like any boundary I tried to assert was a betrayal of her love and a rejection of her new life. And so I stayed quiet, convinced that maybe I was the problem, that maybe I needed to try harder, be kinder, more accommodating, until I realized I was disappearing in my own home. At first, I convinced myself things would improve. I told myself that the boys just needed time to adjust and that Ray's quiet demeanor wasn't personal. But the more days passed, the clearer it became that I was never meant to fit into their picture of family. And though my mom insisted everyone was just navigating new dynamics, I felt more like a guest than a daughter in my own house. Ray never raised his voice or insulted me, but he also never spoke unless spoken to. And even then, his answers were clipped and short, often laced with undertones of disapproval that he didn't bother to mask. Jordan and Caleb followed his example, keeping their eyes on their phones whenever I entered the room, offering half-hearted nods at best and occasionally exchanging glances that made me feel like a stranger intruding on their space. It was as if I had walked into a family that had already decided they didn't need another member, and despite all my efforts to engage, to be polite, to stay out of their way, I remained an outsider hovering on the edges of every dinner, every car ride, every shared silence that felt heavier than words. I started to eat my meals in my room, partly to avoid the awkward silence at the table, partly because no one ever asked if I was joining, and the few times I tried to sit down uninvited, I was met with passive glances and tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. My mother, perhaps seeing the growing distance, doubled down on her optimism, insisting that I needed to be more patient, that Ray was a reserved man and the boys were going through their own transitions, that blending a family was hard but worth it if we all gave it our best. I wanted to believe her, I truly did, but every time I opened my mouth to talk about how isolated I felt, she reminded me of her sacrifices, how she had turned down years of potential happiness to give me a stable life. How now that she had found someone who made her feel loved and seen, she needed me to be strong, to be supportive, to be less selfish. That word hit harder than she probably realized because I had never thought of myself as selfish. I had always tried to make things easier for her, always tried to be the understanding daughter, but now that understanding seemed to come at the cost of my own mental and emotional peace. I started to feel like I was walking on eggshells, not just around Ray and the boys, but even around her, afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid to ask for too much, afraid to take up space. I buried myself in work, volunteering for extra shifts at the clinic, spending weekends with coworkers, or at the public library just to avoid the suffocating tension that waited for me at home. I had no fight left in me, no words that hadn't already been dismissed, and so I smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, and disappeared when ignored. It became a routine, a silent agreement between all of us that I would stay out of their way if they pretended I didn't exist, and though my heart ached with every passing day, I stayed partly because I didn't have the financial stability to leave, partly because a small part of me still hoped that my mother would one day notice how much I was hurting and actually care enough to say something. But she never did. Instead, she continued her life as if nothing was wrong, laughing with Ray in the kitchen, helping the boys with their schoolwork, posting family photos online, where I was conveniently absent, and in every frame they looked like the perfect family, while I sat in my room down the hall, invisible, forgotten, waiting for someone to notice that I was quietly falling apart. It was a Saturday morning in mid-July when everything finally reached its tipping point. I had just finished a long overnight shift at the clinic and gotten home around 7, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. But the moment I opened the front door, something felt off. The house was too quiet, too still. There was no sound of the boys' video games or my mom humming in the kitchen. Not even the distant murmur of a television, just silence that wrapped around everything like fog. I walked through the living room, the hallway, the kitchen calling out quietly at first, then louder, expecting someone to answer, but there was nothing. I checked every room and realized the impossible: they were all gone. I stood in the middle of the hallway for a full minute trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Ray's sneakers were missing. The boys' backpacks weren't by the door. My mom's favorite tote was gone from the hook. Even the dog's leash was missing, and when I opened the garage, the car was no longer there. It wasn't just an early morning errand, it was a departure, a planned and coordinated trip, and they had left without saying a single word to me. My heart started to race, not because I feared something had happened to them, but because I already knew what had happened. They had gone on a trip they had left intentionally, and they hadn't even bothered to let me know. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling slightly, and finally saw a message from my mom sent at 3:22 in the morning. It was short and casually written. She said they were going to Florida for a quick getaway and asked if I could keep an eye on the house while they were gone. No details, no explanations, just a message that read more like a note left on a fridge door than something you send to your own daughter when abandoning her without warning. I stared at it for what felt like hours, rereading it over and over, as if some new meaning would reveal itself. Something that made it less cold, less detached, but it was exactly what it looked like they had left me behind, without a word of kindness or consideration, and they expected me to be okay with it. I wasn't. I wasn't okay. Not with being ignored, not with being used as a house sitter, not with being left out of what was clearly a family vacation, and certainly not with the realization that my presence meant so little to them that they didn't even feel the need to explain. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the empty space around me, trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to call her to demand an explanation, to ask her why she thought this was acceptable. But deep down, I already knew the answer. She had chosen her new family, and in that choice, she had quietly erased me. I did call her anyway, not because I expected comfort, but because I needed to hear her say it, needed her to confirm what I was feeling, and when she picked up, her voice was cheerful, like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just left her daughter behind without a word. And when I asked her why she didn't tell me about the trip, she responded with surprise, almost as if she had forgotten I lived there too. She said it had been a last-minute plan, that they needed a break, and she assumed I wouldn't mind staying behind to watch the house. She even laughed a little, like it was some kind of favor she was doing for me, giving me space and quiet while they relaxed on a beach. I told her I didn't agree to this, that I felt betrayed and disregarded, but she brushed it off, saying I was being dramatic, that I was making a big deal out of nothing, and before I could say more, she hung up. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear long after the line went dead. The weight of that call pressing down on me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the act of leaving that hurt. It was how little she cared about how it would affect me, how she dismissed my hurt like it was childish whining. I packed a small bag, not much, just a few clothes, my work things, a book I hadn't finished, and I wrote a quick note saying I wouldn't be staying there anymore, that if she wanted someone to care for her house, she should have asked for it like a person, not assumed I would take whatever scraps of inclusion she handed me. I left the key under the flower pot by the back door, the same place she always left it when she wanted the dog walker to come in, and then I drove to my father's house, not because I wanted to make a scene, but because I had nowhere else to go, and I needed to be somewhere I could breathe. My dad looked surprised when he opened the door. I hadn't told him I was coming, but he stepped aside and let me in without a word, just looked at me for a moment and then said, "You don't look okay," and that was all it took for the tears to come. I hadn't cried in a long time. I had been holding it together for months, pretending I was fine. But in that moment, everything came crashing down. The isolation, the silence, the constant feeling of being tolerated instead of loved. It all poured out, and for the first time in a long time, someone listened. My dad didn't ask for explanations right away. He simply made me tea and let me sit in silence until I was ready to talk. And when I finally told him everything, every detail about how I had been treated about the vacation, about how my mother had hung up on me like I was an inconvenience rather than her daughter, he didn't interrupt, he just listened, and that alone made me feel more seen than I had in months. I told him about Ray's coldness, about how his sons followed his lead, how meals became silent performances where I was expected to smile and stay out of the way, how my mother always defended them, no matter how much their behavior pushed me into a corner. I explained how she used guilt like a shield, always reminding me of her sacrifices as though they were debts I had yet to repay, how every attempt I made to assert my needs was met with accusations of selfishness, and how I had spent the last year slowly becoming invisible in the one place I used to call home. My dad stayed quiet for a long time, his jaw clenched, hands folded together, the kind of quiet that simmers with anger but tries to stay calm for your sake, and finally he looked at me and said, I didn't have to go back there, that this wasn't something I needed to tolerate just because I loved my mom, and if I wanted to stay with him I could, no explanations, no conditions. I nodded, not because I had a plan, but because the thought of returning to that house, to that silence, to that painful pretending was unbearable. Over the next couple of days, I settled into my father's place. It wasn't big, but it was warm, lived in, filled with framed photos and books, and the smell of strong coffee in the morning, and for the first time in months, I started to sleep through the night. I didn't hear from my mother immediately, which didn't surprise me. She was probably too busy relaxing on some beach, pretending she had left everything in order. Or maybe she thought I would come around and apologize for my outburst like I always had in the past. But I didn't. I didn't text. I didn't call. I didn't ask how the trip was going or pretend like everything was fine. And each day that passed without a word from her only confirmed what I already knew, that I had never really been part of that new family. I had simply been tolerated until I became inconvenient. When I finally did hear from her, it wasn't a soft message asking if I was okay. It was a voicemail full of panic and blame. She said the house had been broken into, that someone had taken their TV and Ray's camera and some of her jewelry, and she was furious that I hadn't stayed like she had asked. I played the message 3 times, stunned not by the break-in, but by the way she immediately pointed fingers at me, as though my absence had caused the robbery, as though I was responsible for protecting a house I had never agreed to watch in the first place. I had tried to call her before leaving. She didn't answer. I left the key exactly where she always did. I even left a note, and yet none of that mattered to her. All that mattered was that something bad had happened, and I was the most convenient person to blame. I didn't call her back right away. Instead, I tried to calm myself. I knew that if I responded in anger, it would only give her more ammunition to claim I was being unreasonable, so I waited. I wrote out what I wanted to say. I rehearsed it in my mind, and when I was ready, I sent a single message. I said I was sorry the house had been broken into, but I wasn't responsible. I reminded her that I had tried to call, that she had hung up on me, that I left the key in the usual place, and that I never agreed to be her unpaid security system. And more importantly, I told her I was hurt, not just by her actions, but by her refusal to even acknowledge my pain. She didn't respond. Not that day, not the next. And I didn't follow up because I had nothing more to say. The silence that followed was louder than any argument, and though it still hurt, it felt different now, not like rejection, but like freedom. 4 days after that message, I received an email from Ray, and the fact that he wrote instead of calling already told me this was not going to be a conversation. It was a statement. The subject line read, "Regarding the house," but what followed had nothing to do with the break-in. Instead, it was a long and oddly emotional letter where he accused me of being cold, manipulative, and intentionally disrespectful to the family dynamic he had tried to create. He claimed that from the beginning I had made things difficult, that I looked down on his sons, that I never accepted their presence, and that he always knew I would be the cause of disruption in the home. The wording was strange, overly dramatic, and laced with accusations that didn't match anything I had actually done. And as I read through the paragraphs, I began to see patterns, phrases that sounded vaguely familiar, ideas that I was selfish, difficult, emotionally unstable. All things I had heard in different ways from my mother during arguments over the past year. And it hit me that Ray wasn't just speaking from his own observations, he was repeating what he had been told. At first, I was angry. How could someone believe such things without even trying to get to know me? But then I remembered that Ray never did try, not really, and I began to wonder why. The pieces started falling into place later that evening when my Aunt Rachel, my mom's younger sister, called me out of the blue. She said she had been hesitant to reach out, didn't want to stir things up, but after hearing from my father about everything that had happened, she felt I deserved to know the truth. What she told me unraveled everything I thought I understood about the past 3 years. According to Rachel, when my mom and Ray had first started dating, there was a conversation about Ray's mother, who was elderly and in poor health. He had wanted to move her into the house once they got married, so she wouldn't have to be alone. My mom didn't want that. She felt it would be too much. She didn't want to take on a caretaker role, even with a full-time nurse involved. But instead of telling Ray directly, she told him that I would never accept it, that I had a history of pushing away the people she dated, that I was overprotective and irrational, and might even lash out. Rachel had overheard part of the conversation during a family dinner and asked my mom about it later. My mom brushed it off, said it was just a harmless white lie to delay the decision, but Ray had believed it completely. From that point on, everything about the way he treated me made sense. He didn't ignore me because of something I did. He ignored me because he had been told to expect the worst from me. He had been warned that I was manipulative and emotionally unstable, and he believed it, no questions asked. I sat on the couch in my dad's living room after the call ended, the weight of that truth pressing on my chest, not just because it explained Ray's behavior, but because it meant my own mother had been the architect of my isolation. She hadn't defended me behind closed doors. She had actively created the narrative that justified pushing me away. I remembered the nights I cried in my room, wondering why I felt like a stranger in my own home. And now I knew the answer wasn't that I failed to connect with them, it was that I had been set up to fail from the start. Later that week, I confronted her. I sent her a message asking if it was true, if she had told Ray that I was emotionally unstable and difficult to live with, and this time she didn't deny it. Instead, she replied that she had been in a complicated position and didn't know how else to handle things. She said she didn't mean for it to go that far, that she thought if things went well, he'd change his mind, that maybe I'd prove her wrong. And when I didn't, it just became easier to let the narrative continue. Her message read like an apology, but it wasn't. It was an explanation drenched in excuses, and though part of me wanted to scream to ask how she could do that to her own daughter, I didn't respond because what was left to say when the person who should have protected you was the one who quietly made others believe you didn't deserve kindness. Days later, my dad told me that Ray had filed for separation. Apparently, after the break-in and our respective silences, he began pressing my mom for answers, and eventually she came clean, and once he knew the truth, he couldn't justify staying in that marriage. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. My mother had lied. Her husband had believed those lies, and now everything was unraveling. Not because I fought back, but because the truth had finally forced its way to the surface. I looked at the email Ray had sent one last time before deleting it, not because I forgave him, but because I no longer needed to carry the weight of someone else's false perception, and for the first time in a long time I felt something close to peace. In the weeks that followed the revelation, something inside me shifted. I was no longer walking around, wondering what I had done wrong, or questioning my worth in someone else's story. I now had answers, painful ones, but answers nonetheless, and that gave me a strange sense of power. Not the kind that makes you want to retaliate, but the kind that makes you realize you don't have to keep explaining yourself to people who never really wanted to understand. My dad, having heard everything, including what my aunt had confirmed, became more protective, not in a controlling way, but in the quiet way that meant he was paying close attention. He asked if I wanted to pursue legal options, and at first I was confused. I didn't think there was anything to fight over. I wasn't a child, no custody battles to be had, but then he pointed out that I was still technically listed as a dependent in certain legal documents. My insurance, some mail, and even parts of my financial aid history. And he said that if I wanted, he could help file to separate me completely from any legal tie to my mother's household. It wasn't about money or status, it was about control, and removing myself formally felt like the final step in reclaiming my life. I agreed, and within days he spoke with his lawyer and set the process in motion. The paperwork was simple but symbolic, and when I signed the last page, I felt a release, like I had just shut a door that was always half open, letting in cold air and doubt. Meanwhile, the situation between my mother and Ray deteriorated. I didn't have front row seats to it all, but pieces came through first from my aunt, then from neighbors who reached out with subtle messages of concern or gossip. Apparently, Ray had moved into a rented condo nearby. The boys were splitting their time awkwardly, and my mother was struggling not just emotionally, but publicly. The image she had curated for so long, that of a woman who had finally built the perfect second family, was collapsing, and she couldn't hide the cracks. I received another message from her, this one longer and more emotional. She apologized again, this time with more desperation, saying she had made mistakes but had always loved me, that she didn't know how to fix what had been broken, but she hoped I wouldn't shut her out forever. I read it twice and then put my phone down. Not because I was ignoring her, but because I was trying to feel something that resembled forgiveness, and it wasn't there, not yet. What hurt the most wasn't just what she had done. It was that even now in her apology she centered her feelings, her regret, her pain, as though I were just a side character in her tragedy. I talked it through with my therapist, a woman I had started seeing weekly since the move, and she said something that stayed with me. She said, "Sometimes closure isn't something you get from the person who hurt you. Sometimes it's what you give yourself when you stop waiting for them to make it right." So I stopped waiting. I stopped checking for messages. I stopped wondering if she would show up at my job or my dad's house or try to explain in person, because I already had the truth, and what I needed now was space to rebuild. Ray never contacted me again, which was probably for the best, though. One day I did receive a short note in the mail unsigned, but I recognized his handwriting from old shopping lists on the fridge. It said, he was sorry that he had believed lies without question, and that he hoped one day I would heal from what they had done. It wasn't long, it didn't beg for forgiveness. And maybe that's why I didn't hate it. It was quiet and straightforward, and maybe even sincere. I didn't respond, but I kept it for a while in the back of my drawer, not because I needed it, but because sometimes it helps to know someone finally saw you clearly. The legal separation process finished smoothly. My dad and I went out for dinner afterward, just the two of us at a diner we used to visit when I was little, and over greasy fries and bottomless coffee. He looked at me and said he was proud of how I handled everything, not because I had been strong all the time, but because I had been honest. I had stood up for myself without becoming cruel, and I had chosen peace over bitterness. That night, I realized something important. Justice isn't always a courtroom moment or a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes justice is simply reclaiming your narrative, stepping away from people who distort your reality, and creating space for your own voice to be the one that matters most. My mom tried once more to reach out, sending flowers to the clinic with a card that read, "I miss you more than you know." But I asked the receptionist to donate them to the local hospice and threw away the card without reading it again. Not out of spite, but because I was done receiving gestures that tried to bypass accountability. I wasn't looking for symbolic apologies. I was looking for peace, and peace doesn't come from people who refuse to face the truth of what they did. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need them to suffer. I just needed to be free from the weight of carrying their choices on my shoulders, and finally I was. Months have passed since everything unraveled, since the silence between my mother and me became a boundary rather than a wound, and in that time I have started to feel like myself again. Not the version of me that tiptoed around a house that didn't feel like home. Not the one who questioned her worth based on how others treated her, but the version who trusts her own instincts, who believes that her feelings are valid even when they make others uncomfortable. I still live with my dad for now. The space he offers isn't just physical, it's emotional. A kind of quiet support that doesn't demand anything in return, and for the first time in a long time, I feel steady. Not perfectly healed, not untouched by the pain, but steady in a way that allows me to breathe without flinching. I've poured more energy into my work, found joy in the small routines of daily life, shared quiet laughter with colleagues, and begun to rebuild a social life that isn't weighed down by the constant need to explain why I look so tired all the time. Some nights I still think about the way things could have been if my mother had made different choices, if she had defended me instead of distorting me, if she had sat down and spoken to me honestly, rather than painting me as the problem to avoid having a difficult conversation with someone she loved. But those thoughts no longer drag me down, they just pass through like clouds that no longer bring storms. I don't hate her not anymore, but I also don't miss her. And maybe that's the hardest truth to hold, the realization that love and loyalty can be worn down by repeated injury until all that's left is distance that feels like safety. I've learned that being family doesn't guarantee protection, that love without respect becomes manipulation, and that sometimes walking away is the most honest form of love you can offer yourself. Closure didn't come in the form of a perfect apology or a tearful reunion. It came in quiet mornings and standing up for myself without losing who I am, and no longer bending to fit into someone else's narrative of who I should be. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my mother. I don't know if she'll ever truly understand the damage her choices caused, or if one day she'll try again with something more honest and less self-serving. But I do know that I won't shrink myself to make room for someone who built comfort on the foundation of my silence. If there's one thing I hope others take from my story, it's that you are not obligated to carry someone else's guilt just because you love them, and you are allowed to choose peace, even when it means letting go of people you thought you'd hold on to forever.